Picture this. You're sitting at your desk, it's late. The kind of late where the rest of the world has gone quiet, but your mind hasn't. On your screen there's a chart, a position, and a number that doesn't look the way you thought it would look when you placed that trade this morning. You've been here before. Not this exact desk, maybe. Not this exact chart. But this feeling, this specific combination of dread and denial, and the faint, stubborn voice in the back of your head saying maybe it comes back tomorrow. You know this feeling, like you know your own heartbeat. You tell yourself you'll check it one more time before you sleep. You already know you won't sleep. This is trading. Not the version they sell you in the highlight reels. Not the screenshots of the wins, not the Lamborghinis. Not the "I turned $10,000 into 2 million" stories that flood your feed at 2 a.m. when the algorithm knows you're vulnerable. This is the real version. The one that happens in the quiet, the one nobody posts about. And here's what I want to ask you. Right now, before we go any further. What if the man who understood that feeling better than anyone who ever lived, better than any therapist, any trading coach, any mentor, wrote it all down? What if he took everything he learned from 40 years of sitting in that exact same chair, staring at that exact same feeling, and put it in a book? What if that book is sitting somewhere within reach of you right now, and most people who own it have never actually finished it? His name was Jesse Livermore. The book is called How to Trade in Stocks, and what's inside it is not what you expect. Jesse Livermore published How to Trade in Stocks in 1940. He was 63 years old. He had spent 4 decades in financial markets, decades that included making and losing fortunes that by today's standards would be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. He had shorted the crash of 1907 and made $1 million. He had shorted the crash of 1929 and made $100 million. He had also gone bankrupt, more than once. He was not writing from a place of triumph. He was writing from a place of hard, expensive, irreversible knowledge. And the first thing that hits you when you actually read this book, not skim it, not extract the highlights, but sit with it, is the tone. It doesn't sound like a man trying to sell you something. It doesn't sound like someone performing confidence for an audience. It sounds like someone talking to you in a room with the door closed after everyone else has gone home, saying the things that are true even when they're uncomfortable. That tone is rare. In any literature, in any field, but in financial literature, as where everyone is either trying to impress you or sell you something, it's almost non-existent. Livermore opens with a line that most people read past without stopping. He writes, "The game of speculation is the most uniformly fascinating game in the world, but it is not a game for the stupid, the mentally lazy, the person of inferior emotional balance, or the get-rich-quick adventurer. They will die poor." Read that slowly. Not the harsh part, though it is harsh, the honest part. The part where he calls it a game, not an investment, not a career, not a system, a game, and then immediately tells you what kind of player you have to be to survive it. Not the smartest, not the most informed, not the one with the best tools or the most capital, the one with emotional balance. That is the thesis of the entire book. Everything else, every rule, every observation, every piece of tactical advice flows from that one idea. The market will not be conquered by intelligence. It will only be navigated, imperfectly, painfully, incrementally, by emotional discipline. There's a trader psychology that Livermore describes in this book that I want you to feel, not just understand, but actually feel. Because it's the psychology of every person who has ever lost money in markets, including, almost certainly, you. It goes like this. You see something, a chart, a setup, a piece of news, something that tells you, and clearly, confidently, with what feels like genuine analytical certainty, that a stock is about to move in a specific direction. You enter the trade, and then the stock does the opposite. Not dramatically at first, just a little. Enough to be uncomfortable, but not enough to be obviously wrong. And here's where the psychology takes over. Here's the moment Livermore spent his entire career trying to understand and master. You don't exit. Not because you've reanalyzed the situation and found new information supporting your thesis. Not because you have a principled reason to believe the initial move is a temporary fluctuation, but because exiting means admitting you were wrong. And admitting you were wrong in that moment, with real money on the line, feels like something more than a financial loss. It feels personal. Livermore writes about this with surgical precision. He describes watching traders, men with years of experience, men with genuine analytical ability, hold losing positions far beyond any rational justification, simply because the act of selling would force a confrontation with their own fallibility that they were not emotionally prepared to have. He calls it hoping when you should not hope. And he says it is the single most common cause of catastrophic loss in all of speculation. Not bad analysis, not bad luck, not wrong information. The refusal, the very human, very understandable, very expensive refusal to accept that you are wrong and act on that acceptance immediately. The market does not care how smart you are. It does not care how much work you put into the analysis. It does not care about your track record or your reputation or the fact that you've been right about this stock before. The tape, the actual price movement, the actual behavior of the market is the only truth available to you in real time. And if that truth contradicts your thesis is wrong. Not wrong forever, not wrong in some abstract analytical sense. Wrong right now. And right now is the only thing that costs you money. The concept Livermore returns to more than any other in How to Trade in Stocks is what he calls the pivotal point. Let me tell you what this actually is, not the technical definition but the feeling of it. Because Livermore wasn't writing a textbook. He was writing about something he felt in his body after 40 years in markets. Something almost instinctive. Imagine watching a river. Most of the time, a river flows in a general direction. There's a current, there's a prevailing movement, but there are moments, specific moments, where the current shifts, where you can see, if you're paying attention, that the energy of the water is reorganizing itself, that what was moving left is about to move right, or that what was still is about to surge. Those moments are rare. They require patience to wait for, they require attention to recognize, and they require action, decisive, immediate action, to capitalize on. That's a pivotal point. In markets, a pivotal point is a price level and a specific number, where the stock or commodity is at a genuine decision moment, where the balance of buying and selling pressure is about to resolve in one direction or the other, where, if you watch carefully enough and wait long enough, the market itself will tell you which way it's going. Livermore's entire entry methodology was built around this concept. He didn't buy stocks because he thought they were undervalued. He didn't buy them because a fundamental analysis suggested they should be worth more. He bought them at the moment a pivotal point was crossed, at the moment the market itself was declaring a direction. And here's what makes this emotionally resonant, rather than just technically interesting. It requires you to trust something outside yourself. Most traders, and most people actually, operate from a framework of internal certainty. They do their analysis, they form their conclusion, they act on their conclusion. The external world is the thing they're trying to predict. They are the authority. Their analysis is the source of truth. Livermore's approach inverts that completely. In his framework, the market is the authority. The tape is the source of truth. Your analysis is just a hypothesis, a working theory that the market will either confirm or deny in real time. Your job is not to be right. Your job is to recognize when you're wrong as quickly as possible, and to act on that recognition without hesitation. This sounds simple. It is not, because it requires a level of ego dissolution that most high-functioning, analytically capable people find genuinely difficult. The same intelligence that generates a sophisticated trading thesis is also the intelligence that constructs an elaborate post hoc justification for why the thesis is still correct, even as the market is clearly saying otherwise. Livermore knew this from the inside. He writes about it not as an outside observer, but as someone who had fought that battle with himself in real trades, with real money on the line, over and over again across 4 decades. There is a chapter in How to Trade in Stocks about what Livermore calls the time element, and it's one of the least discussed but most important ideas in the book. He writes about the experience of being right about a market move but wrong about the timing, of correctly identifying something that is going to happen a breakout, a collapse, a major directional shift, but entering too early before the market is ready to make the move you've predicted. And he describes what that experience does to a trader. You enter early. The trade moves against you, not because you're wrong about the direction, but because the move hasn't started yet. The market is still consolidating, still building energy, still deciding, and you're in a position, losing money, getting psychologically ground down by the uncertainty. Until eventually you exit, often at a loss, just before the move finally begins. This experience is so common, so universal among traders at every level of experience, that it almost deserves its own category of loss. It's not a wrong trade. It's a right trade at the wrong time. And the cost of it is not just the loss in the position, it's what it does to your confidence in your own analysis. After enough of these experiences, you stop trusting your reads. You start second-guessing legitimate setups because you've been burned by the timing element so many times. Livermore's answer to this was patience engineered into the system. He would not enter a trade until the market itself confirmed the move was beginning. He would watch a setup develop, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, without acting, without a position, simply observing. And only when the pivotal point was crossed, only when the stock was actually moving in the predicted direction, would he put money to work. This is harder than it sounds, dramatically harder, because the natural instinct of the instinct that comes from seeing a setup you believe in, from having done the analysis and reached a conclusion, is to act. To get in now, while the stock is still at a good price, before the move you've identified begins, and the entry gets more expensive. Livermore spent his whole career fighting that instinct, not always successfully, but the trades where he succeeded, where he waited, confirmed, and entered at the right moment, were the trades that produced the kind of results most traders only dream about. He writes, "It never was my thinking that made the big money for me. It was always my sitting. Men who can both be right and sit tight are uncommon. Sitting tight. That's the thing. Not the analysis, not the system. The willingness, the hard, active, disciplined willingness to sit with a thesis and wait for the market to confirm it before you commit." That sentence lives in every serious trader's memory once they've read it. Because once you've read it, you see everything in your own trading history through a different lens. Every trade you entered too early, every setup you forced because you couldn't stand the patience. Every time you sold early out of anxiety rather than analysis. You see all of it differently. Livermore writes about money in this book in a way that is quietly radical. He talks about the importance of having what he calls a stake, a specific amount of capital that you designate as your trading capital, that you treat with complete professional seriousness. Not money you can afford to lose, not extra money, your stake, the tool of your trade. And he draws a distinction that most people never make. The difference between being in the market because you have a genuine, well-analyzed, properly timed reason to be there, and being in the market because you feel like you should be doing something. He is devastating on the subject of unnecessary trading, on the compulsion to always have a position, to always be active, to interpret inactivity as laziness or missed opportunity. He writes about extended periods, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, where he held no positions, where he watched markets from the outside with no money at risk because the conditions for high-probability trades simply weren't present. And he describes how uncomfortable that is. Not because he was missing out, he was clear-eyed about what he was avoiding, but because the psychological pressure to act, to be doing something with the money sitting in his account, was real and constant and had to be consciously resisted. This is a feeling every trader knows intimately. The account sitting there, the capital deployed in cash or equivalents, not working, not growing, while markets move and other people seem to be trading. The sense that every day without a trade is a day wasted, that sitting on the sidelines is somehow a failure. Livermore called this feeling the speculator's enemy, not the market, the feeling itself. The itch to act that makes you trade when you shouldn't, enter when conditions don't merit it, force setups that aren't there. He had a term for the trades that come from that itch. He called them sucker trades. Not because the person making them is stupid, he was very clear about that, but because the impulse behind them is not analysis or opportunity. It's the inability to sit still. And the market, Livermore believed, was exquisitely designed to punish that inability. It would always offer something that looked like an opportunity. There would always be a stock moving, a chart pattern forming, a piece of news that suggested action. The market's supply of pseudo-opportunities is essentially infinite. The real skill, was not in identifying opportunities. It was in correctly distinguishing a genuine pivotal point from a pseudo-opportunity that looks real but isn't. That distinction only develops over time, through mistakes, through the slow, painful accumulation of pattern recognition that comes from watching markets closely over years and being honest with yourself about what you got wrong. One of the things that makes How to Trade in Stocks different from almost every other trading book ever written is that Livermore doesn't just tell you what to do. He tells you what it feels like when you do it wrong. And he tells you that with a specificity that can only come from having done it wrong himself, many times in high-stakes situations where the cost of being wrong was enormous. There's a passage where he describes the experience of watching a position turn against you, not a small move, a real reversal, the kind that forces a decision. And he describes the internal dialogue that happens in that moment. The calculation you run, looking for any data point that supports staying in. The memory of every previous trade where you exited early and missed the eventual recovery. The narrative you construct, the market is being irrational, this is temporary, my thesis is still valid. That keeps you in the position when logic and discipline say to get out. He calls this the speculator's self-deception. And he says it is not a character flaw, it's not stupidity, it's not weakness. It is the predictable, almost inevitable result of having money at risk, combined with the human brain's remarkable ability to find patterns and narratives that support what we already want to believe. The market exploits this ability ruthlessly. Every time you have a losing position, the market gives you something, a small bounce, a piece of news, a momentary stabilization, that your brain can grab onto as evidence that the move is reversing, that staying in is the right call, that the pain is about to end. Sometimes that evidence is real, often it isn't. And the only way to tell the difference, the only reliable method Livermore found across 40 years, was to have a predetermined exit, a specific price, decided before the trade was placed, that represented the point at which the premise of the trade was definitively wrong, and to exit at that price without negotiation, without the internal dialogue, without giving the self-deception any room to operate. He writes, "Losing money is the least of my troubles. A loss never troubles me after I take it. I forget it overnight. But being wrong, not taking the loss, that is what does damage to the pocketbook and the soul. Being wrong and not taking the loss. That's the thing. Because you can be wrong, and it costs you the planned amount and you move on. Or you can be wrong and refuse to accept it, and it costs you everything. The money, the confidence, the ability to execute properly on the next opportunity. The psychological damage of a loss you held too long doesn't disappear when you finally close the position. It follows you into the next trade." Livermore devotes significant attention in this book to what he calls the line of least resistance. It's one of his most important concepts, and it's one of the most misunderstood. The line of least resistance is simply this: at any given moment, the market has a direction it's more naturally inclined to move, not because of fundamental value, not because of what analysts say it should be worth, but because of the actual balance of supply and demand, of buying pressure and selling pressure in real time. Your job is not to determine where the market should go. Your job is to determine where it is actually going. This seems obvious. It is not. Because the moment you have a position, the moment real money is tied to a directional bet, the line of least resistance stops being an objective observation and becomes something you negotiate with. You start to see what you need to see. You interpret ambiguous price action as supporting your thesis. You discount the price action that contradicts it. You are no longer reading the tape. You are editorializing it. Livermore's discipline, the discipline that produced his greatest trades, was the discipline of reading the tape without editorializing, of seeing what was actually there, not what he needed to see, of following the line of least resistance regardless of whether it confirmed or contradicted his prior analysis. This required something that is genuinely difficult for analytically capable people: the willingness to be wrong publicly, to change direction without a narrative justification, to simply say, the market is moving this way now, so I move this way now. No story, no explanation, no vindication required. Just the tape, just the truth of what prices are doing. Just the line of least resistance followed with discipline and without ego. The traders who could do this, who could genuinely subordinate their own analysis to the real-time message of the market, were, Livermore believed, the only traders who could survive and prosper over the long run. Because markets change, conditions shift. What was true last month isn't necessarily true today, and the only reliable source of truth about what's true right now is the price action itself. There is something in how to trade in stocks that hits differently the longer you've been in markets. Livermore writes about the emotional cycle of a trade, not as a psychological theory, as an experience, something you feel in sequence, almost without exception, every time you're in a significant position. It starts with confidence. You've done the work. You've identified the setup. You've waited for the pivotal point. You've entered with discipline. Everything feels right. You feel the particular clarity of a trader who believes they are correctly positioned. Then comes the test. The position moves against you, not far, maybe not even to your stop, but enough to introduce doubt, and the confidence shifts into something more guarded, more watchful. The feeling of being right becomes the feeling of hoping you're right, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it's there. Then, if the trade is working, how comes the relief? The position moves in your direction. The thesis is confirming. The discomfort lifts and is replaced by something that feels like vindication, like your analysis is being validated by the market in real time. And this is the most dangerous moment. Not the loss, not the doubt, the relief. Because the relief, the emotional release of a trade moving in your direction, is precisely when discipline is most likely to collapse. When you're most likely to take profits too early because the relief feels so good that you want to lock it in before it can be taken away. Or conversely, when you're most likely to ignore warning signs that the move is ending because you're so deep in the feeling of being right that you can't see the market changing direction. Livermore writes about this cycle because he had lived it thousands of times, and what he understood, what took him decades to understand, is that the emotional cycle is not the enemy. It's not something to be eliminated or suppressed. It's something to be recognized, named, and not acted upon. The trade should be managed by the rules set before the trade was placed. By the predetermined exit, the pyramiding structure, the specific conditions that would expand or reduce the position. Not by the emotional weather of the moment, not by confidence or doubt or relief or fear. The rules are the rules precisely because they were made in a calm, clear state before any of these emotions were in play. They are the best version of your judgment, applied in advance, so that the worst version of your judgment, the one operating under emotional pressure in real time, doesn't get to make the decision. Toward the end of How to Trade in Stocks, Livermore writes about something he calls the speculator's tragedy. It is not what you might expect. He doesn't write about losing money. He doesn't write about bad trades or broken systems or markets that turned against him. He writes about the traders he watched over 4 decades who had everything they needed to succeed: the intelligence, the capital, the analytical ability, even moments of genuine mastery, and who still ended up losing. Not because the market defeated them, because they defeated themselves. He describes men who had winning systems and abandoned them during drawdowns, right before the system worked again. Men who had the discipline to cut losses and then lost it after a long winning streak made them feel invincible. Men who understood, intellectually, every principle that governed successful speculation, and who still couldn't maintain the emotional consistency to apply those principles when it cost them the most to do so. He writes about this not with judgment, with something closer to grief, because he recognized himself in all of them. The speculator's tragedy in Livermore's telling is not failure. It's the particular agony of being close enough to understand exactly what's required and still not being able to consistently deliver it, of knowing the rules, having followed the rules, having profited enormously from the rules, and still finding in certain moments, under certain pressures, that the rules gave way to something older and more powerful, something human. He writes, "It takes a man a long time to learn all the lessons of all his mistakes. This is not a defeatist statement. Read it again. It takes a long time. Not forever, not never. A long time." Livermore believed the education was possible, that through enough mistakes, honestly examined, a trader could develop the genuine understanding, not just the intellectual knowledge, but the deep, cellular, almost physical understanding of what the market requires. He believed it was worth the cost. He spent his entire life making the argument by example that it was worth the cost. So what do you actually take from how to trade in stocks? Not a trading system, not a set of rules to copy, not a formula. What you take is a mirror. You take a way of looking at your own trading, at your own decisions, your own patterns, your own emotional responses to winning and losing, that is more honest and more clear-eyed than almost any other framework available. Livermore doesn't tell you what to do. He shows you what happens when you don't have discipline. He shows you the cost, in exact, specific, unambiguous terms, of the decisions that feel natural and human and completely justified in the moment, but that slowly, consistently, reliably destroy capital. He shows you hope, not as a virtue, but as a mechanism of loss. The voice that says maybe it comes back when the tape is saying something else entirely. He shows you impatience, the compulsion to act, to be in the market, to find opportunity in conditions that don't offer it, and the steady, grinding toll it takes on a trading account. He shows you ego, the attachment to being right that makes exiting a wrong trade feel like personal failure, and that turns a manageable loss into a catastrophic one. And then, quietly, he shows you something else, something that doesn't get talked about as much. He shows you what the other side looks like, what it feels like to wait with genuine patience for a genuine pivotal point, to enter with confirmation, to size correctly, to add only when the market confirms, to exit without negotiation, to follow the tape without editorializing, to trade not from the noise inside your own head, but from the actual real-time honest message of the market. That is the other side. Not perfection. Livermore never claimed perfection, but clarity, the particular clarity of operating with a system, with discipline, with the humility to let the market be the authority and your analysis be the hypothesis. He found that clarity. Not always, not consistently enough to protect everything he built, but he found it often enough to produce results that still, a century later, have never been matched. And he wrote it down. In 214 pages, published in 1940, available right now wherever you find books. If you've owned it and not finished it, finish it. If you've never read it now. Not for the tactics, not for the rules. Read it for the feeling it gives you of being understood by someone who really knew, who sat in the same chair, felt the same feeling, fought the same internal battles, and took the time at the end of a long and complicated life to write it all down as honestly as he could. That's rare. That's worth your time. The link is in the description. And if this is the kind of depth you're looking for, the real psychology, the real mechanics, the real stories behind the traders and investors who shaped how markets work, LC Books and Life is where you find it. Every episode goes this deep. Every episode is built around the idea that understanding how the greatest minds in financial history actually thought is more valuable than any tip or prediction anyone could give you. Subscribe if that's what you want. We'll be here.